Good day, everybody. Welcome to the Demas-Rampersad Seminar. This is quite different to what we normally do, which has been a Zoom meeting and those kind of things over the last 2 years. So we're really happy to have you in person. This seminar is being streamed, so it will be available even post seminar for you and for others to join in. I am pleased to have with us today IDB, Rosenblatt, who is the economic advisor to the region for the IDB. And so David is very much in tune with the issues that the region is not just trying to deal with region. He is an economist with 27 years. So not just 27 years, but 27 years of experience. Issues in Latin America and Caribbean, and simultaneously run the chief economist office. So he is well placed to understand and discuss, and he's a really great listening to talk to you about the history of the development of the region, and also the history of other regions in the world. So we are very pleased to have David with us. And I would also like to welcome the other members of this team, with us, who is the country representative for the IDB. So David is for the region, and then we have David country representative. So without further ado, David.
Thank you very much. This might be a little bit different presentation from what we're used to in this seminar series. I'll give them a mess, but that's okay with everyone. Stay just the same. It's not a purely academic presentation. So you might be used to some professors coming from other universities and digging into it in depth into a paper. Instead, it's more of an institutional paper, and it's based on reflections of decades of working in multilateral development banks and thinking a little bit about the role of research and knowledge sharing, how important that is in these institutions. Because we think of these development banks as banks, right? As financiers. But I've become convinced over the years that it's actually not the most important role. And we'll try to make that case to you. It's not the most important role whether we're talking about other regions of the world or other countries in the Caribbean. It's also the case for the impact creators of trying to be traveling again after all the COVID experience. But here's a general outline of the presentation. I'll just give you some basic background information on the IDB, what it is, its history and organization, and mention to you we're famous like the World Bank for being a lender, get into how that works a little bit to know the basics of that. And then I'll pass on to the knowledge function. And there's some academic type papers, I think research papers, but some academic papers that are trying to think through the typology of knowledge and how that fits into what our institutions do. And I'll relate that to where the IDB might have a particular role in the global development knowledge ecosystem. And then finally give you a few examples that are strictly from the Caribbean. You can get an idea from how we try to work on the knowledge of the Caribbean. So what is the IDB? Inter-American Development Bank. But I intentionally put in the first line that it's a multilateral development agency. It's more than just a bank. And that's to be immediately established in 1959, 48 member countries. 26 that are actually borrowing. The other countries are more like donors. They bring capital in, but those are the rich countries that do not access financing institutions. And then there's the IDBG, G for group, which includes IDB Invest. Lending function of the IDB traditionally was with governments, but with the creation of IDB Invest, they actually try to be sort of like almost like a venture capital. They try to provide private capital to the private sector, right? In strategic sectors. Recognize that without private sector growth, you're not going to have any kind of. And IDB Lab, which is really sort of the innovation branch of the IDB group, with the small projects, they are really sort of more like venture capital, right? help a startup with a little bit of seed capital to do something really, really good. So the lending function. First, there are loans, basically two types of loans. Investment loans, we call them investment loans, but I think most people in finance would call it project finance. That's financing a specific investment project. But then there's also policy-based loans, which that's the formal name in our institution. I think generally people in finance would take that. This is just general finance for the general budget. Also, it's also more than just loans, right? So originally, when the World Bank was founded years before the IDB, the initial intention was that market failure in international capital markets could be resolved by guarantees, right? So that the institution would use its capital base to provide a backstop guarantee for, say, bond issues or commercial loans to developing countries. And that's what would solve the market failure. You have to actually make a loan, you could be behind that with guarantee. And we still have that instrument. It's been sort of though a second tier. It hasn't been as wide used as one in such a widespread way as the actual direct loans. And then there are other financial products, and this is relevant definitely in the Caribbean, that we can, our finance department can sometimes do swaps and convert these loans into local currency, essentially, depending on the country. And then finally, as I mentioned before, it's the clients can be governments or the private sector through IDB. And how does this happen, right? So you have, this is a very stylized version of the balance sheet of the IDB. On the asset side, you have loans, right? That's the bank in that sense. And then there's a lot of money that's just invested, mostly in US government bonds. This is the investment portfolio. So it's the lending portfolio and investment portfolio. Then you have the capital base, which is partially paid in by governments. But part of it is accumulated profits since 1959, when the institution was set up. But then what really happens is we use the fact that we have this capital. Very importantly, we are considered a preferred lender, right? So the government has to pay us back first before they pay back the private capital markets. It's not just us, it's also the World Bank, IMF, etc. And with that structure between the capital and this backing of the security of being a preferred creditor, plus the simplistic backing of all the rich countries that are members, we're able to have a AAA credit. So we can borrow from capital markets. And we see that's where most of the financing of the loans comes from, is actually borrowing in the markets. And then that way we can provide loans that are much cheaper than the governments who are borrowing companies can do themselves. Makes sense? Was following that? Okay. So this is sort of the basic way that the lending function, right? And we do make a small amount of money on these loans because we charge a little bit more than we actually pay in the borrowing of our bonds. We charge a little bit of the spread on the loans we give to governments. So that's a basic lending function. Now let's move on to for me, it's partially because of my bias, because I'm an economist, and economists have been working at these organizations for a long time. And this is the characteristic of the World Bank, the IDB, the Asian Development Bank, any multilateral development bank. There is this knowledge function. So when these banks were set up, there was the perception that there was imperfection in international capital markets, right? And this market failure needs to be solved by these multilateral development banks. I would argue there's also market imperfections. It's not truly a market, that's part of the issue. But there's actually imperfections in production and consumption of knowledge, right? And part of that is that there's this sort of almost infinite demand, and countries and the citizens of countries, the developing countries are frustrated, right? They want to find solutions. They want to see what can make their own companies grow, what can make their countries grow. Policymakers have almost an infinite demand for knowledge, and there's a limited supply, right? In country and in the world more generally. And part of that, you can think of it, just comes from basic public economics, right? That there's this quasi-public good nature of knowledge, right? Your basic, what's the definition of a public good? It's non-rival, right? Which means that it can be consumed by multiple agents with their consumption not affecting the consumption of other people. Think of a recipe for making food, right? All of us could be cooking things with the same recipe, right? At the same time, my use of the recipe doesn't mean that you can't use it at the same time, right? So that's the non-rival part of knowledge. Ideas are there, and they can be used. There's also the non-excludable part, which some parts of knowledge can be excludable. And think of a recipe, right? Maybe 40 years ago, for all of us to use the same recipe, we had to go out and buy the same cookbook, right? But there's where the excludable part comes in, and then you can actually make money by selling the recipe, right? Nowadays, you can just copy them or PDF files and send them to your friends. Everyone can get access to these things pretty much for free. So the excludability part starts to break down, right? Then there's also, being quite frank, sometimes national political forces will inhibit the creation of this knowledge. It could be just lack of support for actually dedicating resources to the budget for research, right? Supporting universities where we are today, or supporting statistical institutes to create the data that we need. So that can be a force that limits the supply of knowledge. And then finally, just simple capacity constraints, right? I mean, we don't have enough of you studying at universities and becoming knowledge professionals. And then finally, just like capital doesn't flow perfectly across countries, sometimes knowledge does, right? And we're learning from experience. And so you need sometimes these professionals at multi-level development that instead of running around from one country to another, and I can have a conversation with a technical person in the ministry and tell him or her the story of something I learned in another country, right? And that's another function that we fill as we run around the region or getting on this Zoom or phone calls and interacting and spreading knowledge. Finally, it's important to recognize that one basic way of categorizing what we do in development banks on the knowledge front is that we deliver it through knowledge products, right? We're used to that seen on reports and on the website, and some research papers that we produce in journals. But we also sometimes produce knowledge through the lending function, right? So if you take, if the government of Trinidad and Tobago or any other government asks for a loan to finance a health project, right? Along with the actual money, you also get a health sector specialist who's going to be advising on design. You get a procurement specialist to be advising on how to do the public offering. You even have a lawyer that might help you think through legal problems. So you get this whole team, and they have knowledge and experience with development projects, and that's another way of delivering. So, friends of mine from the World Bank, a number of years ago, produced this paper where it's actually an institutional mandate for them to start thinking a little more deeply about this knowledge function. And they came up with this way of categorizing the knowledge space. They were trying to think about how the World Bank would fit into this space. And one of the most obvious categorizations is just tacit knowledge versus explicit knowledge, right? And by tacit, it can be the stuff that's stuck in my head or in your head, which can come from years of experience can be things like judgment that just come from experience, the intellectual capacity, right? The ability to analyze. Some ways you might, in today's context, you might think all those things that there's no way artificial intelligence will ever be able to capture, right? Then there are explicit things that you actually produce a paper, you just deliver something that is in written form, verbal form, a data set that's explicit. You can also think of abstract versus routinized. You can think of more of the deeper thoughts of coming up with new theory, right? For thinking about any particular topic in economic policy. You can also think of toolkits that can be routinized that we can deliver to people, that they can then plug in the numbers, financial programming model for thinking through your budget, things like that that can be built that way. And then there's this issue of public versus private. Part of that is I just talked about the good nature of knowledge. Some pieces of knowledge, some knowledge products, just everything we write is on the web and it's free access, right? It's in the public domain. But there's another dimension there in terms of public versus private. And to be totally frank, sometimes government entities will ask us for private advice. Right? We're not experts on how to message political policy reform necessarily, right? And so it's actually a legitimate concern sometimes. Sometimes for governments to want to have a private conversation about policy reform, because then they need to be able to figure out how to make it work through the political system, right? Which is just a reality in democratic settings and everything else. And so the way things are communicated actually matter, right? And sometimes we are really, it would be presumptuous for us, for me, from Washington, to understand, to think that I would understand the best way to do it. Right? What I can offer is my knowledge and my analysis and skills, but that's not my skill set. That's for politicians. So again, there's this whole variety of type of research and delivery mechanisms that we engage in, and the types of research, right? So there's these formal products, actual reports that we see, these informal conversations, public versus private. We have an actual policy that, default options make everything public. There's data, right? And we actually sometimes get involved in how these examples of data. Toolkits, visualizers. The other thing that we try to do is even after we produce a report, try to create some other communication modes, right? Blogs or even podcasts. And in that way, we can target different audiences. The paper might be more for academic expert audience, and then and it also could be for well-informed policymakers. But then to get out into the public, again, we're living in democratic systems here. We need to condense things and explain things in a way that the average citizen in person could understand. So getting into this nitty-gritty a little bit more, dissecting this knowledge function, right? What do I think is my view? Some of the things I think that we have a comparative advantage in this knowledge ecosystem. One is we have precise local knowledge and regional knowledge. I'm sitting in Washington focused on the Caribbean. I'm talking Victor Galto here. He's sitting in Guyana and focused on Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago. And by living there, he sees things and hears things that I don't hear in Washington. And that brings a different perspective when you trying to formulate research questions. Then we also have this regional view, which is kind of, that's a little bit more where I come in when Victor and I talk, right? Is that, having that distance sometimes is actually an advantage. See how countries are doing relative to the rest of the world. But also we have resources, right? And so we can subsidize the production of knowledge and data. And sometimes the binding constraint is money, and sometimes we do help finance, we're financing the household survey that as we speak. But also in the case of certain household survey, we're providing technical advice on survey design and working with very closely with the firm that's actually doing the survey. And that's also the case for research. We can work together with the government counterparts, civil society counterparts, universities, to subsidize the production of knowledge through collaborative efforts. The other thing we have to offer is the multi-sector disciplinary aspect. And for those of you who are maybe thinking of someday working in a multi-level development bank, one of the joys as an economist is to be there and talking to, say, an engineer who's a specialist in the electricity sector. And then you start learning these things about the basic science and mechanics of the electricity system that we're not learning in our economics textbooks. And so this interaction of different disciplines really does bring a different perspective. And also we can join teams together. So you have the economist, the engineer, etc. But it's also cross sectors, right? Where sometimes, say, social policy is thought through in a multi-sector concept, right? Because resources obviously are scarce, and if you just focus on education without thinking about health and social assistance programs, you're going to come to the wrong conclusions about how much money should go to each sector within the broader social sector portfolio of activities. And then finally, this practical hands-on experience, right? Again, this is something I enjoyed interacting with some of my colleagues who might not be economists. They might not have PhDs, but they've actually administered things. They've administered projects in the field. Some of them are former government officials as well. And so there really is that practical experience that we really valuable for people actually trying to implement the finance strategies. Or not finance, sometimes we're just there having informal meetings with government technical staff who can provide. So I'll give you a bit of an overview of some of the stuff that we're working on in the Caribbean, but also at least one example I'll give you for Trinidad and Tobago. We do have people in my economics team who are producing research papers and publishing in journals. We also do more sort of policy notes that are less technical and less academic, but are based for policy dialogue. We have kind of a flagship magazine that's called, used to be called the Caribbean Quarterly Bulletin, now rebranded as the Caribbean Economics Quarterly. What we try to do is sometimes we're doing sort of just an update on the macroeconomic situation and putting in comparative perspective across the countries where we work, but also comparative perspective to the rest of the world and look at some of the external forces that are impacting those economies. Then other times we'll work with a sector colleague and get into a specific sector policy issue that to go to drawing on research from some colleagues in sector departments on the cost of digital infrastructure, and get done some work on the economic benefits of digital infrastructure. And so we presented the findings in a summarized way that pretty much a layperson could understand. So we're trying to reach a broader audience. And then we also have internal projects that we have to do in our corporate role. Every 6 months, we have to produce an assessment of macroeconomic work on. And that has an important corporate role because multilateral governments in general all have a policy that in order for policy-based loans to be done for general budget support, the macroeconomic framework of the country has to be adequate. The idea there is if the country's economy is about to slide off into a crisis, this budget support will be considered. And so you really want to make sure that the basics of macroeconomic sustainability are in place before giving that type of lending. In the case of the IDB, we have a formal policy that we have to have a review every 6 months in every country, and then it's our chief economist who decides whether we have to. So that's an internal thing. We can do that for the countries that we carry as well. I know we've been trying to push really hard on the data. I'm going to give you one example of that through a partnership. But for years, colleagues have worked with that much longer than I have. I've been working with governments to come up with the first labor force survey, providing technical advice, sometimes financing it. And that's another area where I think is really, really important. So I mentioned this magazine that we do, American Economics Quarterly. Last edition was on financial firms. It was some enterprise survey data and also some general data on financial sector development, comparing across countries, and giving some perspective of how Caribbean is doing relative to the rest of the world. Some big conclusions there were just there seems to be a little bit of a bias against small firms in terms of access to finance as reported by the firms in sample. And there seems to be a bit of a bias against women-led for the data. And also naturally, since the data was being undertaken during COVID, the depths of the COVID pandemic, we also found that firms are having a lot of trouble with access to finance than they did in 2014, the last time that we did the survey. We did kind of a light piece at the start of the year, which was a year in review graphs. This is something for the general public, right, to get an idea of what's happening in the economy, the local economy, and they get that picture that easy to read. And then digital infrastructure, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. So data. This is one example that's specific to the Caribbean region, which is this organization called Peak Caribbean, has existed for it's about 10 years now, and they do a lot of things to support private sector development in the region. But one thing that I particularly like, that's close to my heart, is primary data production. So in 2014, they did an enterprise survey across the Caribbean. And the most recent one was this survey, which was conducted in late 2021. And as mentioned before, this is a beautiful regional public good. It's a partnership of the IDB, the government of the Kingdom, Caribbean Development Bank, government of Canada. And so the resources are brought together. It's administered out of our country office, Barbados. Just click on this. Another thing that the team has decided to do is to create a data visualizer. Again, this is a nice way for people who are not necessarily technically inclined. Meanwhile, for the technically inclined, for students and academics, all the data is available on this website. You can just download the data file. Or an Excel file if that's really like use it. And I'm really hopeful that we might be able to start doing this survey much more often. I would love this to be done at least every other year. So we can start to get a better feeling of how this is, it collects perceptions data, sort of like business climate and what the main barriers to investment for this is from the entrepreneurs. It also collects actual objective data like balance sheets, use of labor, how many workers you have, what actual gross sales are. So people have been doing papers on productivity and all this stuff. So keep your eyes open. There's going to be some papers coming out in the public domain in the next few months, and we might actually dedicate one of our upcoming Caribbean Economics Quarterly to summarize those papers. I think this is a beautiful project. I do hope we'll be able to keep this consortium of interest will be able to keep producing this data, do it on a frequent basis. So this is a paper that was, so now we get into a different type of product. Like this is a research paper that was published recently in the Review of Economic Studies. One of the lead authors is our colleague, Boyer, who's based in Washington. To highlight Robert Jackson here, who was born in Trinidad. He's a professor at Northwestern University. Mother's Trinidadian, his father's Jamaican. Making quite a name for himself. Became a full professor, endowed chair at Northwestern, and doing some really wonderful work. And what this paper was focused on a real simple summary. I will summarize, but it's actually a paper that's really calling the attention of education experts back in Washington, in the IDBs, but also in academia, because they have access to administrative data over decades, right? What schools students attended, and then also outcomes in terms of employment, etc. Of course, there's the test scores. So one of the really important conclusions of this paper is that the value added of schools is multidimensional. If you look at just test scores, that's not enough. Because they find that schools that are not necessarily that good at the test scores actually really good at other social outcomes. So in terms of lower crime rates, lower teenage pregnancy rates. And so that makes you think that, well, schools are delivering more than just educated minds in the traditional sense of cognitive skills or passing, doing well on tests. There's also these other social outcomes that are really, really valuable too, right? The second part of that is sometimes in other studies where the researchers were looking at school choice mechanisms, they would find that school choice mechanisms were not functioning properly in terms of parents being able to send their students to the right schools in terms of better test scores. But if you opened it up beyond test scores, you actually see that in the case of the Caribbean, parents were identifying the best schools, but in different dimensions, right? So some of the students that were more academically inclined, they were going to the best schools in terms of test scores. Other students were actually pointing to better schools in terms of social outcomes, non-cognitive social outcomes. So it's really changing the thinking about what is the value out of schools. It's changing the thinking about whether school choice mechanisms are effective. And here you have it. This is coming out of the group. Right? This is a study on the education system in Trinidad. And again, I think that's sort of where some of the things I was discussing earlier in terms of our comparative advantage come together, right? This, my colleague Peter, he's been working on this part of Latin America, the Caribbean, for like 9 years, and he's made good contacts with policymakers around the region. He's been looking for different places where he can find the right data, and then he's been doing a number of papers with this Caribbean gentleman, Mr. Jackson, Professor Jackson. And so it's been a series of papers that really, I think, are extremely high value for informing policy choices in future sectors. We'll put other social policy issues that we have both teachers and parents. So let me just kind of summarize and end on a call to action. So I love coming to universities. I love being in the university environment. I kind of grew up on what my dad was a college professor for many years. And so, for those of you who are interested in economic development, it's one of the most exciting specializations in economics nowadays. When I was in graduate school, development economics as a field of economics was kind of at a low point in the 80s, early 90s. There was a bit of the notion that all of traditional economic theory applies everywhere. So you don't really have to look at differences for developing countries. That's not the case anymore. And development economists in the profession have been some of the leaders in developing new techniques for our profession. So please get into development economics. If part of your career might take you in the policy direction, these multilateral development banks are wonderful places where you can actually interact with policymakers and also still be able to do research if that's your taste, right? And it'd be a wonderful part of your career. It would also be a nice part of your career if you do want to become the pure policy development and become an official of the Ministry of Finance or some other ministry where you're the economist on board helping people figure out education policy, whatever. You spend a few years in a place like the IDB and give it entry points and also a wonderful work environment to work across sectors, work across disciplines. So please get into development, keep up your studies, and we welcome you with open arms. As a final point, I'll mention, getting back to here at this particular campus, a dear friend who used to be part of my team, Demas-Rampersad is a graduate, is undergraduate and PhD here. He's now moved on to the World Bank, unfortunately for me, but he seems to be quite happy there. I mean, if I could fill up my team with G patterns, I'd be super happy. So please keep up the good work and hope to be part of the dialogue with you.